Good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to yet another webinar brought to you by SIOS. My name is Neil Snorkier. I am the Chief Executive Officer of SIOS. For those who don't know, SIOS is the South African Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, a SAQA recognized professional body that professionally register occupational health and safety practitioners in South Africa, irrespective of the industry that you are operating in. We have three professional designations, namely technical member, graduate member, and chartered member. With regards to this morning's webinar, just looking at the numbers, we can see that it's important for us to engage with the Department of Employment and Labour and for the specialist of the particular departments to bring us the message and explain to us when new legislation is promulgated and implemented. In this case, the Hazardous Biological Agents regulations. SIOS has CPD verified this webinar with one SIOS CPD point. SIOS members can, after the webinar, go to their profiles and claim the one CPD point. Please note that we do not issue certificates for the CPD attendance. You will receive an attendance confirmation email tomorrow, which you can use to upload as proof that you have attended this webinar for your CPD points. A huge thank you to one of our corporate members, IntraTrain from Ken Annandale, that has made available a professional PowerPoint training presentation, which is going to be made available free to all the attendees as well as our SIOS members. We will be posting in the chat box the link to that PowerPoint presentation. In addition to that, you will also obviously receive the recording of this webinar as well as the presentations that's made today here by the Department of Employment and Labour. That will be made available on our website, on our YouTube channel. The video will be there, as well as a direct email sent to all members with the links to the presentations and the YouTube video as well. This webinar this morning is not facilitated by SIOS. We only provide the platform, the professional Zoom platform, as well as the live YouTube streaming that's going on at the moment, because we received over 1,000 delegates for this webinar this morning. So it's also live on YouTube at the moment as well. And if any of your colleagues perhaps contact you and say that they cannot get into the webinar because it's full, please refer them to our YouTube channel where you will be able to view it, or your colleagues can view it live. The Q&As, please just make sure that you post any questions and related to the various presentations in the Q&A, please not in the chat box. The chat box is not monitored for questions and answers. The chat box is for exactly what's happening at the moment, meet and greet, and maybe if you have any sound issues or want to say that you can't see properly the video or something like that, and we'll try from a technical point of view to see if we can rectify it. So please, questions and answers, questions goes into the Q&A. The Department of Employment and Labour have specialists online as panelists, and they will answer those questions as far as they can, and hopefully we can answer all those questions. As indicated, a video recording will be made available as well as the presentations. And then just before I hand over to the Department of Employment and Labour to present this webinar this morning for us, I just want to inform members that we are very pleased to announce that we will be going forward, starting in July, start with our provincial free-to-attend OHS seminars again. For those of you that's been members for some time will know that we 10 times a year visited 5 provinces with latest topics and presented live free-to-attend OHS workshops for our members. Please look out on our website and our newsletter for the announcement when we will be starting with these well-received OHS webinars in the future again, starting in July. I've just been corrected that you can claim 2 CPD points for attending this webinar today, not 1, it's 2 CPD points. Thank you for listening to me. I'm now going to hand over to Elise Lawrence from the Department of Employment and Labour, who will be the program director for this webinar. Please sit back, enjoy. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. I'm Elise Lawrence from the Department of Employment and Labour, and I'm a specialist at head office. I would just from my side like to thank Niels and Gareth for hosting us again on their platform this morning. It's always nice to partner with professionals like yourself. From my side, welcome to everybody, and I would then like to formally hand over to Mr. Pomotso Mapa, the Chief Inspector and the man who is leading the Occupational Health and Safety team at the department currently, for him to formally welcome you to this workshop today. Over to you, Mr. Mapa. Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Mapaha. We can't hear you at the moment. We still can't hear you, unfortunately. Maybe just try and unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Correct. There was just something wrong with my PC. I had already unmuted on the other side. Good morning, everyone. Let me start by thanking our partners in occupational health and safety. I call them our partners, SAYOSH, because of the tremendous role, the big impact that they are having in terms of occupational health and safety. And over the years, I don't want to identify individuals, but over the years, I have seen the impact that SAYOSH is making, the challenges that they pose to us as a department. They can only make us better. It is always good to have a partner who encourages you to do better. So let me take this opportunity to thank them and for allowing us to use their platform to send out these messages to everyone out there. Program Director, allow me, I've prepared some few notes here that I want to refer to them. I want to say to the masses today that the vision of the Department of Employment and Labor, you may have noticed that we are no longer called the Department of Labor, but we are called the Department of Employment and Labor, meaning that it is crucial for us to ensure that we preserve the current employment and we create more employment in any industry in the country. And our vision as the Department of Labor is to strive for a labor market which is conducive to investment, economic growth, employment creation, and decent work. Just as a way of background in opening today's seminar, since the emerging as a global crisis in early 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a profound impact everywhere. The pandemic has touched nearly every aspect of the world of work, from the risk of transmission of the virus in workplaces to occupational health and safety risks that have emerged as a result of measures to mitigate the spread of the virus. The department, and in particular, the Inspection Enforcement Services branch, together with the Compensation Fund, have taken this opportunity to raise awareness and stimulate dialogue on the importance of creating and investing in a resilient and combative occupational health and safety system, drawing on both government and private sector in mitigating and preventing the spread of COVID-19 at the workplace. The country went into national lockdown from the 27th of March 2020, which meant that all non-essential services were immediately impacted by the closure. This brought the economy to a virtual shutdown in order to put in place the necessary policies, systems, and structures to manage the arrival of COVID-19, that is SARS-CoV-2. While there was a regulation in place in the form of the hazardous biological agent, a decision was taken to introduce stronger policy in relation to COVID-19 that responded directly to the pandemic. The department amended the regulations for hazardous biological agent, that is the HBA. The promulgated HBA have been drafted in such a manner that provides regulatory framework to respond to pandemics that may encroach in the workplace. The regulations apply to all workplaces under the scope of the Department of Employment and Labor, whereby HBA is produced, processed, used, handled, stored, or transported. Ladies and gentlemen, let me take this opportunity to thank you very much for attending this webinar. And we have got a lined up of speakers, well-known, and who have got a wealth of knowledge that they will share with us today. Please do not be afraid to engage in robust debate with everyone that is here. That is the purpose of this webinar. I would rather have people who challenge the law so that we can change it and make it a better law, rather than those who would try and adhere to a law which will impact on them negatively. Ladies and gentlemen, let me take this opportunity again to thank you very much for attending and wish you well in this webinar. I would be joining on the background, just listening to every discussion that is being made. Remember that every contribution counts when it comes to amending these policies and regulations. Thank you very much. Over to you, Madam Lawrence.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mapa, and thank you for availing yourself this morning. We hope that you'll be able to join us for the remainder of the workshop as well. With that, I would like to hand over to Ms. Bulelwa Huna. She's a senior specialist for occupational health and hygiene at the department head office, and she will elaborate for us a little bit on the purpose of the workshop today. Over to you, Mrs. Huna. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lawrence. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is another great day for the department as we host another webinar on the regulations for hazardous biological agents. We are doing this in collaboration with our partners, SIOSH, as well as our knowledgeable speakers. As the OSH Act places the onus of the common law duty of reasonable care on the employer, what does it mean in the face of the pandemic as principles and rights at work have to be observed? In June 2019, during the International Labour Organization centenary celebrations, it was declared that safety and health at work are fundamental to decent work. This declaration is even more significant as businesses resume work whilst we are still in the face of the pandemic. This week, safety and health at work as a fundamental right was discussed during the International Labour Conference, and this received favorable consideration from all constituencies, because all constituencies agreed that safety and health at work are fundamental rights that must be adhered to for all people at work. Today, a decision will be made on this aspect, and this will impact on all conventions that address OSH aspects in the world of work. The program of today, like with previous programs, is designed to support the information that you require with respect to your preventative programs in relation to HBAs in the workplace. We are honored that you have joined the webinar, and we'll be listening to knowledgeable speakers who will be taking you through the different aspects as indicated in the program. And I am requesting your interactive participation. Thank you, Ms. Lawrence.
Thank you so much, Ms. Huna. Thank you for those inspiring words and just the indication of how everything fits in at a more global scale as well. We are still a couple of minutes late, but we'll make up those few minutes shortly. So I'm going to hand over to Ms. Jabulile Mhlope to present to you the main event of today. The reason why we've all logged in on a Friday morning is to listen to her presentation on the regulations for hazardous biological agents. With that, over to you, Ms. Mhlope. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues. I'm gonna share my presentation now. Okay, my presentation is on the hazardous biological agents regulations. And I would like to mention that some of the regulations will be skipped because we've got other members who will be presenting on those regulations. So it's not a mistake that I'm skipping some of the regulations. Under the introduction, we are saying biological agents are living organisms or products of living organisms. They are defined as any microorganism, microbial byproducts or metabolites, cell or organic material with plant, animal, or human origin, including any which have been genetically modified. And they include viruses, bacteria, fungi, and their metabolites, as well as parasitic worms and plants. Also, hazardous biological agents may cause infection, allergy, or toxicity, or create a risk to human health, and they are subdivided into the following groups. Group 1, it's an HBA that is unlikely to cause human disease. Group 2, it's an HBA that may cause human disease and be a hazard to exposed persons, which is unlikely to spread to the community, and for which effective prophylaxis and treatment is usually available. Group 3, it's an HBA that may cause severe human disease, presents a serious hazard to exposed persons, and which may present a risk of spreading to the community, but for which effective prophylaxis and treatment is available. And group 4, it's an HBA that causes severe human disease and is a serious hazard to exposed persons, and which may present a high risk of spreading to the community, but for which no effective prophylaxis and treatment is available. There were some definitions that were included in the new regulations that have been recently promulgated. So I'm just gonna speak on those new inclusion of the definitions. There is biohazard, which means any potential laboratory source of harm caused by a biological agent, microbial byproducts, or metabolites. Also, we've included the definition of a competent person, means a person who has, in respect of the work or task to be performed, the required knowledge, training, experience, and where applicable, qualifications specific to HBAs. So as the department, we are not really prescriptive to the employer who a competent person is, as long as that person has got the required knowledge, the training, the experience, or the qualifications were applicable for that specific task to be performed. And we have also developed a document as a department stating clearly or making it clear how we expect from the employer when it comes to the nomination of a competent person. That document is found on the website of the department. And I would request Mr. Malone to put the link for that department on the chat box. Also, we've included control measures, means measures that remove, prevent, or reduce the exposure of persons to HBAs at the workplace. Decontamination means the procedure that eliminates or reduces biological agents to a level that does not cause harm with respect to the transmission of infection or other adverse effects. Laboratory means a room or part of a building equipped for experimentation, research, testing, or manufacture of drugs or chemicals of which may manipulate microbiological agents. Safety equipment means equipment which is designed to prevent exposure to HBAs. Universal precautions means an approach to infection control to treat all human blood and certain human body fluids as if they were known to be infectious for human immunodeficiency virus, hepatitis B virus, and other blood-borne pathogens. Ventilation means the process of supplying or removing air to or from an indoor space for the purpose of controlling air contaminants level, humidity, or temperature within the space. Verification means the process of establishing the accuracy or validity of something. Now we come to the scope of application. The regulations apply to every employer or self-employed person at a workplace where an HBA is produced, processed, used, handled, stored, or transported, or where exposure to an HBA may occur. As we have seen with the pandemic for SARS-CoV-2, that at workplaces whereby we did not expect the presence of HBAs, there were cases of COVID-19 from other workplaces, like the offices whereby HBAs are not really produced, processed, or handled. Therefore, that's why the scope of application is applying to all workplaces. Under information, instruction, and training, an employer must ensure that any employee at risk of being exposed or exposing others to HBAs is comprehensively informed, instructed, and trained. Why we are emphasizing on these three aspects of information, instruction, and training, because it is important that employees need to understand the environment at which they are working and that they may be exposed to HBAs and what would be the repercussions of them being exposed and what measures they need to take to protect themselves and others towards that. Therefore, they were saying the employer must inform, instruct, and train with regard to the following: the content and scope of these regulations, the potential risks to health caused by the exposure, the measures to be taken by the employer to protect an employee against any risk of being exposed, the importance of good housekeeping at the workplace, and personal hygiene requirements, as we have seen with the pandemic that we recently had with SARS-CoV-2, that housekeeping and personal hygiene are very important. The precautions to be taken by an employee to protect him or herself against the health risks associated with the exposure, including the wearing and use of protective clothing and respiratory protective equipment. The necessity of risk-based medical surveillance, the safe working procedures regarding the use, handling, storage, labeling, and disposal of HBAs at the workplace, the procedures to be followed in the event of exposure, spillage, leakage, accidental release, injury, or any similar emergency situation, and decontamination or disinfection of contaminated areas. Meaning that employees need to be informed about all these measures that are put in place to protect them from or reduce the exposure to HBAs. The employer must ensure that the information, instruction, and training are provided before an employee is potentially exposed to HBAs. The employer must conduct refresher training annually or at intervals that may be recommended by the Health and Safety Committee or the health and safety representative. This has been included because we have found that a once-off training, it doesn't really help, because, you know, as people, we get used to the environment and then we do things the way we think is all right. But with refresher training that is conducted annually, it will ensure that employees are sensitized again with the environment on which they are working and what measures they need to take to protect themselves. Every employer or self-employed person must ensure that any person who in any manner assists him or her in the carrying out of the business duties has the necessary information and has undergone instruction and training in order for him or her to identify potential risks and the precautions that should be taken. Duties of persons who might be exposed. Any person who is or might be exposed to HBAs must obey any lawful instruction given by the employer regarding the following: the prevention of an uncontrolled release of an HBA, the adherence to instructions regarding environmental and health practices, personal hygiene, and good housekeeping. The appropriate use of personal protective equipment and clothing, as we know that in most of the time, you will find that employees are provided with PPE, but the manner in which they use it, it's not the correct way. So it is expected of the employees to obey any lawful instruction given by the employer. The appropriate wearing of personal samplers when necessary to measure personal exposure to airborne HBAs, the disposal of materials containing HBAs, and the disinfection and decontamination of any workplace contaminated by an HBA, and the reporting during normal working hours for medical examination or tests if it's identified through the risk assessment that or you should be under medical surveillance. And information, instruction, and training as contemplated in Regulation 4, as I've mentioned before. Any person must immediately report to the employer, the health and safety representative, any possible exposure to an HBA at the workplace. Therefore, it's also the duties of employees to report if they suspect that there might be a possible exposure to an HBA. Exposure monitoring of HBAs. An employer must establish and maintain an exposure monitoring program at the workplace, which is representative of the employee's exposure to HBAs. The exposure monitoring program must be conducted by a competent person as it is defined in accordance with a validated procedure which is sufficiently sensitive and of proven effectiveness, conducted at intervals determined in the risk assessment, but not exceeding 24 months. What we are saying here is that if there is a need for the exposure monitoring to be conducted, maybe after every 6 months, as indicated in the risk assessment, that it's applicable, but the period must not exceed 24 months. Conducted when any change occurs which may affect the exposure. So if there any change, maybe in the process or equipment, then the monitoring program must be reviewed. Under records, an employer must keep records of all training, exposure assessments, exposure monitoring reports, and medical surveillance reports. make the records available for inspection by an inspector, a health and safety representative, or a health and safety committee, but excluding personal medical records. As you see that these records must be available for inspection, I'm just going to comment on the report, on the records for training. We cannot just get attendance register as a training record, meaning that we also need to get the content of the training that was provided to employees to check if that training was relevant to the environment in which the employees are working in. Therefore, it's important to also keep the manuals for that training. Also make personal medical records available to any person subject to the formal written consent of the employee consent. So if there's any person who wants access to personal medical records of an employee, that person needs to get a consent, a written consent from the employee. Whether it's an inspector or any other person, that consent must be received. Keep all records of risk assessments, medical surveillance, and exposure monitoring reports for a minimum period of 40 years. Keep all records of the equipment, examination, and tests carried out, and of any repairs resulting from the investigation and tests for a minimum period of 5 years. This is usually a challenge when we visit employers and we request these records, especially for equipment, examination, and tests carried out. They would usually say, yes, this equipment have been maintained, but you will never get the records. So now it is a requirement that these records must be kept, must be available and be kept for a period of 5 years. Keep all records of training given to an employee for as long as the employee remains employed at that particular workplace. As we know that with occupational diseases, some of them might not be manifest immediately, but they take time to manifest themselves to an employee. And if the employer or self-employed person ceases activities, hand over all the records to the relevant chief director, provincial operations, which they are available from all our 9 provinces. PPE and facilities. If it is not reasonably practicable to ensure that the exposure of an employee is reasonably controlled, the employer must, in the case of airborne, ingestion, and contact transmission, provide the employee with suitable protective equipment and protective clothing. And HBAs that can be absorbed through the skin provide the employee with suitable, impermeable personal protective clothing. Where respiratory protective equipment is provided, the employer must ensure that the relevant safety equipment is capable of preventing the exposure to the HBA consent, and the relevant safety equipment is correctly selected, fitted, and properly used. For an example, the employer cannot provide a dust mask for an employee who is exposed maybe to HBAs in a laboratory setting. Employees are informed, instructed, trained, and supervised with regard to the use and disposal of the safety equipment. We have included the issue of supervision because we have seen it as a weak point or a weakest link when it comes to employers, whereby they will train and instruct the employees on how to use the equipment, but the issue of supervision will be lacking. Therefore, now supervision is a requirement. The reusable safety equipment is kept in hygienic condition and efficient working order. An employer must, as far as is reasonably practicable, not issue personal protective equipment which has been used to an employee unless it is capable of being decontaminated and disinfected prior to use. Provide separate containers or storage facilities for protective equipment and protective clothing when not in use. And take steps to ensure that all protective equipment and protective clothing not in use are stored in a demarcated area with proper access control. An employer must, as far as is reasonably practicable, ensure that all contaminated, reusable personal protective clothing is cleaned and handled in accordance with the following procedures. Where such clothing is cleaned on the premises of the employer, care must be taken to prevent contamination during handling, transporting, and cleaning. As we know that there are facilities that have laundries within their premises, therefore they need to ensure that during the collection or the handling and transporting, there is no contamination that is taking place, especially for our cleaners. Where clothing is sent off the premises to a contractor for cleaning purposes, the contractor must place the clothing in impermeable, tightly sealed, color-coded containers, and such containers must be clearly identified with a biohazard label as depicted in Annex B of the regulations. And where clothing from facilities handling HBA risk group 3 and risk group 4 agent is sent off the premises for any purposes, it must first be decontaminated. Subject to the provisions of the facilities regulations, an employer must, where reasonably practicable, provide employees using personal protective equipment and clothing with adequate washing facilities which are readily accessible and located in an area where the facilities will not become contaminated, in order to enable the employees to meet the standard of personal hygiene consistent with the adequate control of exposure and to avoid the spread of HBAs. Separate clean and contaminated change rooms if the employer uses or processes HBAs to the extent that the HBA could endanger the health of persons outside the workplace. So what we're saying here, if employees are working in an environment whereby an exposure to HBAs might cause the spread maybe to the outside working environment, the employer can provide the washing facilities, and this will also be identified in their risk assessment. Prohibitions. No person may use compressed air to remove HBAs from any surface or person, as we know that compressed air will just make it worse and contaminate all the areas. No person may eat, drink, smoke, keep food or beverages or apply cosmetics where an HBA is handled or require or permit any other person to eat, drink, smoke, keep food or beverages or apply cosmetics in such a workplace, or leave a controlled area without prior removal of potentially contaminated protective clothing and safety equipment. As we know that this is previously it has been a challenge, I'm not sure now, whereby you find that people do not remove potentially protective clothing when they leave contaminated areas with HBAs. An employer or self-employed person must cause a notice and or signage to be posted at a conspicuous place containing the provisions of sub-regulation 1. Most of the time, in most areas, the no smoking sign will always be there, but you hardly find a signage whereby for not eating or drinking or keeping food where there is exposure to HBAs. I hope from today on, people will ensure that all the required signage will be put up. Labeling, packaging, transporting, and storage. An employer or self-employed person must, as far as is reasonably practicable, take steps to ensure that all HBAs under his or her control in storage, transit, or being distributed are properly contained and controlled to prevent the spread of contamination from the workplace. The color-coded containers in which HBAs are transported are clearly marked with a biohazard sign as depicted in Annexure B of the regulations and other relevant warning signs that identify the contents. Transport of HBAs is performed with due consideration of Chapter 8 of the National Road Traffic Act 1996 and the International Air Transport Association Infectious Substances Shipping Regulations, and the employer or self-employed person must, when it comes to the disposal of HBAs, lay down written procedures for appropriate decontamination and disinfection, meaning that all those employees who will be dealing or handling the HBA waste, they will have a written procedure informing them what to do when they handle this waste. Implement written procedures enabling infectious waste to be handled and disposed of without risk. Provide sufficient hazardous waste containers for disposal of used personal protective equipment. Ensure that all fixtures, plant, and machinery, including vehicles, reusable containers and covers which have been in contact with HBA waste are disinfected and decontaminated after use in such a manner that it does not cause a hazard inside or outside the workplace concerned. So all those procedures will have been written down so that every employee is aware of them. Ensure that all employees involved in the collection, transport, and disposal of HBA waste and who may be exposed to that waste are provided with suitable personal protective equipment. Ensure that if the services of a waste disposal contractor are used, a provision is incorporated into the contract stating that the contractor must comply with the provisions of these regulations. As we know that with mostly health sector establishment, such contracts are done at the national level. The copies of those contracts must be sent to the local institutions or hospitals or clinics so that when inspectors visit such places, such contracts are available for inspection. Ensure that HBA waste that can cause exposure is treated and disposed of only on sites specifically designated and authorized for this purpose in terms of the National Environmental Management Waste Act in such a manner that it does not cause a hazard inside or outside the site concerned. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Slope. I think that was really a mouthful. And yeah, I think from the questions, we can see that things, colleagues are awake and alive and interested in this. As you also indicated in opening, that some of the regulations were not dealt with by a presentation. They will be dealt with by upcoming presentations. And I think especially looking at some of the questions that have been asked in the Q&A, a lot of questions will be answered by the next presentation on risk assessment. But before we go into that, I think we can just quickly steal 2 or 3 minutes. There are 2 questions that we would like for you to just answer live. I'm going to read them out to you, and if you can just provide us with answers to that, I think everybody would be interested in answers to those. The first question is from Buthelezi. In a financial institute where SARS-CoV-2 is the only HBA that employees could be exposed to, is it required for employers to conduct exposure monitoring / medical surveillance? If you'd like to provide us just with an answer to that, Jabu.
Okay. Unfortunately, the presentation is still coming on the risk assessment. But before an employer can institute whether an exposure monitoring program or a medical surveillance program, it will be based on the risk assessment. As I've already said, that medical surveillance is risk-based. So if during the risk assessment, there is a need for an employer to conduct an exposure monitoring program because it has been found that there is a risk of exposure to HBAs, then the employer must do that. And also if there is a need for employees to go under for medical surveillance, yes, they will have to do that. It doesn't matter which sector, as long as there is a risk of exposure to HBAs.
Great, thank you so much. And just maybe to add on, I think it's a dangerous assumption to assume that the SARS-CoV-2 virus is the only HBA in those work environments. Thank you for that. And then moving then on to the second question that we'd like to take live, and it's from Christopher. As HBA regulations now apply to effectively every workplace, are all employers then required to do medical fitness assessment, medical surveillance? I think it links into your previous answer as well. Jabu, please.
Yes, I think, yeah, it links to my previous answer that the risk assessment will indicate whether all or other employees need to undergo medical surveillance.
Right, thank you for that. And with that, looking at the time, I'm going to quickly move on to the next presentation before we take a comfort break. I'm going to, just from my side, thank Sean Chester for once again availing himself to do this presentation for the department. It's much appreciated. It gets very boring if we have to listen to one voice the entire day. So it's nice to break it up like that. Sean will introduce himself. I see he's presenting under Apex Environmental, but I'm sure there will be a slide somewhere in there indicating green flag as well. But Sean, please entertain us with your presentation on the risk assessment for hazardous biological agents. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Elise. Thank you, Mr. Mupaha, for the invite as well today, and obviously to Jabu and the team for actually hosting this really, I think, groundbreaking moment in our South African history and these regulations as well. And yeah, certainly to SIOSH for the work that they do to facilitate this as well. That's Gareth and Neil. So thank you so much for having me. Yeah, so my job today is to actually unpack the risk assessment component of it, and hopefully I can do it in an entertaining way, Elise. Thanks for that pressure. But yeah, certainly, if you look at the Q&As that have been going on, the risk assessment forms such an incredibly fundamental part of actually how you manage your risk. It really is the sort of the shoulders of what you actually have your whole management plan built upon. So it carries everything. So really, that's where the issue of competence comes up, and it's one of those questions that comes up again and again and again. It doesn't matter whether it's around risk assessments for HBAs or hazardous chemicals or whatever it is. Competency is such a central and key area to that, and we'll unpack that a little bit further as we go. So let's just first describe this. Now, I'm not going to give you a whole bunch of slides. It's just going to have writing on it, but I think it's important that we understand in the context of the risk assessment what a biological agent means. So a biological agent is not only a pathogen that actually, like a virus or a bacteria or a yeast or a mold or anything like that. It's also an organic material. So you could have cotton dust and you could have grain dust, and that also fall under the scope of these regulations as well. Around the competency as well, we need to sort of just unpack that slightly. And that is, you have to have experience, you have to have knowledge, and you have to have an understanding of what you are trying to do. Now, a competent person may be a part of a team, and I think that's very important for us to understand. I might be an occupational hygienist, but I might actually have to call on a doctor or a toxicologist or something like that, to depending on the complexity of the environment. So very important for us to understand that a competent person, yes, is one person, but it also can involve a team and a multidisciplinary approach that you would have to undergo to understand certain environments. And some of them are highly complex. So we just to unpack the groups again, in the bottom right-hand corner, you can actually see there's just there's a lot of COVID on, so I quickly threw this into my slide. So COVID is it's a group 3 hazardous biological agent, and it used to be a group 4 before the vaccine, so it was downgraded to a group 3. So the V in those parentheses is actually the vaccine for the virus, and so what you have to do is that you have to classify each hazardous biological agent in your environment, and you'll have to classify it according to its group, and that is actually the basis for how you would approach your risk assessment. So we also have to understand that an HBA is produced, processed, used, or handled, or stored, or transported. So it's any environment where these HBAs are actually either handled or produced or stored or anything like that. Sometimes they can be incidental. So it could be something like, let's use the word COVID again, or fecal matter in the kitchen, where somebody might actually go to the toilet, they don't wash their hands, and they come back into the kitchen, and then they start preparing food. But it also could be very direct as well. It could be a place where like a laboratory, where they might be conducting experiments on hazardous biological agents that involve hazardous biological materials, etc. as well. So wherever that actually occurs, these regulations apply to that too. So they have to be classified, and I think I've spoken about that well enough already, but we need to make sure that we understand that that's our first part, is like, what is the biological agent and what's its classification? If there isn't a classification, it's actually up to the employer to conduct a risk assessment and assign the biological agent of one of the groups. And if there is doubt according to its level of risk of infection, then you basically always apply the higher one. So if you're going, well, I think this is a group 3, but maybe it's a group 4, then you classify it higher, because obviously then that would influence the way you would control the exposure to that as well, and your risk ranking, and we'll talk about that as we go. So the actual regulation themselves around the risk assessment it's very, very well put together. Well done, Jabo. And it's very procedural, and it's very systematic. So this is how you would go about a risk assessment, in the same way with any kind of chemical agent or noise, physical agent, or whatever that is. You would actually conduct that risk assessment in a very systematic way. So we'd actually have to make sure that you've got the competency as well within that, as we've spoken about. But then what we're looking at, what is the nature of that hazardous biological agent? Is it a virus? Is it a bacteria? What is the route of exposure? Is it direct or indirect transmission? Is it from touching a handrail, a surface, preparing food, mixing foods together? And we'll look at that a little bit later under the control measures. But really, you actually have to define what it is and how that is actually going to get into the body, because this is what we're talking about. We're talking about disease and disease etiology and that. So we have to, and then so we go directly into the idea of dose, and so dose is obviously the poison. So it doesn't matter. You can be exposed to, let's go back to the COVID side of things, where they're thinking around about 100 quanta, 100 of these viruses can actually initiate the disease. And there's also then obviously the amount of time and frequency and duration of that exposure. So it's concentration, frequency, and duration. And when you put those things together, you get an idea of what the risk is. So where the biological agent might be, in what physical form. It might be an aerosol. It could actually be in a piece of material matter. It could be a cotton dust that is actually airborne or otherwise sort of entering. The nature of the work, obviously, when you're doing risk assessment, you look at the work, you look at actually how that work is conducted. Is there energy being installed into the system? Like if you put energy, generally you find if you put energy into a system, you'll actually get an exposure. So the higher the energy, whether it's heat or whether it's mechanical energy, you'll have like things becoming airborne, or there will actually just be straight transfer of those biologicals into the environment. And then obviously, what are the control measures in place? How effective are they? And this is very important in your risk assessment, colleagues, is that look at that reasonable deterioration. It's all very well having state-of-the-art control measures, but what would the risk relationship be for that process if there was a deterioration, if there was a failure in your ventilation system, or if there was a failure in your gloves? If you don't double glove, maybe that would be another control measure, but you're single gloving and you're, okay, this is fine, I can handle it. But what happens when there's a failure in that moment? What actually happens to that risk? Does it actually elevate the risk as well? And obviously, what effects the HBA can have on the employee, that's what it's all about. And Prof. Zungu will actually speak about it a little bit later on. Very importantly, included in this regulation is actually looking at pregnant and immunocompromised and vulnerable employees. And I think that was a really good catch on the regulation side. So well done. So again, I'm not trying to overwhelm you with content over here, but this is how you've got to unpack it. So when do you have to conduct this risk assessment? So you have to classify it. So what is the relevant risk group according to its level? So you will actually see Annex A itself. Okay, is that schedule of the grouping of it. So it's I showed you that slide earlier where we actually had coronavirus as a group 3. Then we have to look at the recommendations from the manufacturer, the supplier, or a competent person. So the manufacturer might provide you with an SDS and say, okay, hold on, when you've got this, unpack the SDS and actually understand very, and I think it's like section 11 of an SDS generally that will talk about it. And so you need to be given the information on the disease that might be contracted based on those activities at work, and what are those potential allergic infections and toxic effects. So remember, biological agents don't only cause a disease like the flu. What it actually also does, let's talk about grain dust, causes a pulmonary reaction. You get allergic asthma, and then you actually get you end up being sensitized to it. So you've got to be very, very aware, and that's where the competency comes in as well. You've got to have a knowledge of the diseases. And so then you also have to, this basis of this risk assessment is so important because you have to consider the recommendations that are made out of that. So if you don't have that competency to draft it, and if you don't have that multidisciplinary team if necessary, your risk assessment will form the foundation of all your control measures. And your control measures are around the recommendations. So you have to make sure that they're all very stratified, and they are very consistent with the risk as well. Not unnecessary either. So control measures aren't always supposed to be like an overshoot of everything and be completely crazy, but they can also just be a sort of a toned down version of what you might think. Like we know with COVID, I've got some opinions around mask use, around ventilated areas and all that sort of thing. And so we just need to make sure that that risk assessment adequately addresses the environment, no more, no less. So then you have to have a documented action plan, and you have to implement those recommendations. Then you've got to review it at least 24 monthly. Obviously, if there's a change to the process or if anything like that goes out of sync with operation, you actually have to go back and revisit your risk assessment. It's very logical. So when you go and do a risk assessment, and you've got your competence and you're armed with your knowledge and your experience and your team, obviously, you're going to walk into the environment, you're going to look at that observation, you're going to look at your existing records. Do you have previous risk assessments? Do you have SDSs? Do you have everything that you have? Then you'll go into the environment and you will sit down and you will question the workers, the supervisors, the process, and you'll look at all that technical and trade literature on it. And then obviously, then you'll start compiling that documented risk assessment. So we're really doing it to build this cohesive picture of the workplace, the hazards and the associated risks. So what we do then, once we've finished compiling the entire sort of risk profile, or risk character of the environment, then we'll use a risk ranking tool. I just want to quickly skip to this slide before we go on to the risk ranking tool, and it's an important one just to understand that there's so many different types of transmission pathways. So there's droplet transmission, there's contact, there's airborne transmission, common vehicle transmission, which is but basically being given something like an item or food or device or equipment. And then there's obviously vector-borne transmission, mosquitoes, the Anopheles mosquito when it comes to malaria, or the snail, Afrikaner snail when it comes to bilharzia, etc. I consider those. And then we also have to understand what the various types of, I'm sorry, I'm actually going to, issues are around the transmission chain, because if we're going to interrupt this transmission chain, that's our job. For doing the risk assessment, we have to understand what is the reservoir, where does it come from, how is it stored? Like if you're looking at, say, fungi, mold, spores, and everything like that, that could be stored right inside the plaster of the wall. And now you think you might be able to control it just by taking a cloth and wiping it. But you might be better placed to rather take that whole ball and break it down. And depending on how established that reservoir is. And then the portal of exit for the contamination to happen. The biological, it has to get out of the reservoir, has to be accessible. So again, it's around about that pathway. How does it go? How does it actually become, does it become airborne through the mode of transmission? Is it direct contact? Then how does it get into the human being? Through the respiratory tract, the digestive tract. So we all understand, and we've all been sick. So biologicals, we do understand how they all work. So how do they get into us? And it's very important for the risk assessment to consider this. And well, who's the potential host? In our case, it's always going to be the worker, because that's what this regulation is about. It's about the employer looking after the work and conducting everything. So we have to break that link, and that will actually reduce the risk of infection. So what we'd use the hierarchy of controls. And what do those hierarchy of controls look like? We know we're going to start with elimination, right? First thing we do is actually, how do we get rid of it? If we can't get rid of that biological, maybe we can actually use a less transmissible one. So if you're doing experiments, say with tuberculosis, for example, maybe you'd want to use a different type of tuberculum bacteria that is actually less formidable, and you'd actually go down in that. And I know we've done some experiments with ventilation systems on this. And you want to use something that's a mycobacterium, but it's not actually a tuberculosis that is actually super strong, super viral, and causes tuberculosis itself. But you have something that actually has all the exact same profiles. It's a bacillus. It's got a very hard shell. It can actually withstand some temperature adjustment, but it can also survive for duration. So that would be an example of sort of substitution. And then obviously you sort of aggress all the way through. So you go then into engineering. Eliminate it, you'll use fume hoods, etc., biohazardous cabinets or whatever, and then you go up to your administration. And your administration is very important, folks. I mean, there's this long part of my career has actually been around how to actually encourage people to do the administrational side properly, because that is obviously your management system falls completely flat when you don't administer it properly. And then you get to your personal protective equipment, etc., which is your last line of defense. But in South Africa, what do we do, colleagues? Yeah. So then what we're going to do, once you've got sort of this risk ranking, we'll have a look at the health effects or the severity ranking. So what we generally do within our organization is we actually take the group itself, and that is really how we look at the severity. We put it on a scale of 1 to 4. You can do a 5 by 5 or 1 to 4 risk matrix, and then you'll put it on that scale, and then you'll have a look at the important parts of that exposure, the route of entry, the potential dose. Remember, dose is primary when it comes to looking at the exposure probability, which is your duration of exposure, frequency of exposure, as well as your existing control measures, which actually inform what your dose is as well. And this is, so you can get very complicated risk matrices, and I'm sure you're all aware of this, colleagues, because we're speaking to the converted here when it comes to risk assessments. But you would see that you've got your X and Y axes, and then you would assign your health effect rating. If you want to use this is 0 to a 4.5, and let's just say you're assigning a group 3 hazardous biological agent, say like SARS-CoV-2, and what will happen is you'll sign it there. Then you'll look at your exposure rating. Is your exposure either moderate or very light, very low exposure, medium exposure, right up to very, very high exposure? So you end up with like a very high risk ranking up here if you take it through that. Then you can look at the other exposure type of matrices as well. We'll use multipliers, and you'll assign it a number, and you'll apply the X and Y axes in multiplications, and you'll end up on this sort of graduated risk ranking from very low to very high. So kind of this is how all these matrices work in their own right. Elise said I would mention green flag, and I can't not mention green flag. Part of the COVID response that we had, we formed an association called the Green Flag Association. It's a not-for-profit organization, and it does a lot of advocacy work. It does a lot of media representation, and we work with COVID Commons as well as Business for South Africa, BUSA, and so we help them develop and understand. And this is the risk ranking that we use for green flag as well. And it took a lot of time to develop this. But you can see with COVID, we are primarily focused on ventilation systems. And so when you start looking at like COVID and the production of that disease, you have to be quite specific. So this is an example of a bespoke risk matrix solution for a specific type of contaminant. So you could use it for any airborne pathogen. But and a pathogen that's generated out of the respiratory system. So you'd be looking at your maximum occupancy rate, whether there's low vocalizations or not, and whether the carbon dioxide concentration, and I'm sure Toby's going to speak about that a little bit later on, is this correlation between carbon dioxide and ventilation rates. It's fairly complex, and you do need competence to be able to assess it. And then you graduated with like higher vocalizations, and then even like frequent shouting and talking loudly, like let's talk about a bar environment. This is a direct cut and paste out of sort of one of the reports that we produce, and you can look. We look at it, Staphylococcus aureus, Salmonella typhi, and Escherichia coli. And so E. coli is a very interesting one, because a lot of people think, oh, the E. coli levels are high, so it must be dangerous. But you must recognize that E. coli is actually an indicator organism, just like carbon dioxide is an indicator gas for the amount of fresh air inside an environment. E. coli is an indicator organism for the potential for fecal contamination. So E. coli is a normal enteric bacteria within our stomachs, and what happens is that if we don't wash and look after our hands properly after we've been to the toilet, E. coli would be the one that would be the most easily transferable and then measurable as well, because you might not have an enteric bacteria that is actually a pathogen. So what we do is we'll actually list it, we'll give it a group, and then we'll go engineering controls, administrative controls, and we'll assess those and unpack those as well. So this one was for a food handling premises, and you can see a stainless steel workbench has been provided to prepare food, a cutting board has been provided, meat is defrosted in a dedicated bowl. But there was, I think there was something in here where we didn't actually have the right separation of food. So there are issues with the overhead extractor, as were noted as well. And so what we do, and folks, if we go back to what a risk assessment has to do, it actually has to look at what is achievable and what's existing. And also, what happens if it actually fails? So this is your risk ranking line over here. We'll use, wasn't from the same report, it's a different one. So if you're an HBA group 3, you would actually look at what we can achieve, what was existing, and what happens when there's a deterioration in control measures. And that's a requirement of your risk assessment. And then you can see that we graduate the exposure levels, the potential dose based on all those criteria: frequency, duration, and concentration expected. And then we will graduate that risk up there as well. So what are we trying to achieve with this risk assessment? But what is the purpose of the risk assessment? So ultimately, we have to look at, is there any additional monitoring that we do? We might need to quantify. We might need to go and take instrumentation. We might need to monitor with AGARs or something like that. And that's Safisa over there doing some carbon dioxide monitoring inside a beauty salon. Prof. Zingel will talk about medical surveillance, and he's got a really excellent presentation. And I think you'll be way more enlightened after that. I certainly was. Prevention and control of exposure is your final thing. So what are the recommendations? So these are your low-hanging fruit when it comes to your risk assessment, because whatever you kind of are unsure about, you're going to want to monitor, and you're going to want to quantify properly as much as you can. But you can often just solve the entire exposure chain or the exposure problem by actually having this, by just putting sort of straightforward interventions in, like ventilation or whatever it is. So if you look at the slide on the top left-hand corner, you've got the Anderson sampler. What it does, it actually draws air through over a sort of a Petri dish. It's a 75 millimeter Petri dish, and that would actually have agar trapped in it. And you can collect bacteria, total bacterial counts. You can do speciation. What you do is you collect it onto an agar plate, and you can send it off to a laboratory, a path lab, and they can actually then unpack exactly what is actually growing there. So each one of those agars that actually is contained there, it's actually a nutrient media, and they catch a certain classification of bacteria or fungi or mold spores and that sort of thing. We don't catch viruses in those, unfortunately. Viruses are incredibly complex to monitor. And so that's a direct sampling method. An indirect sampling method, as an example, is a carbon dioxide meter, where you would take something like maybe a handheld meter into an environment, and you'd actually have a look to see what the concentrations are, etc. And then we would actually be able to make some kind of risk correlation for transmission. And then you can see even our president we managed to get him through Green Flag to actually, and we unpacked the importance of carbon dioxide monitoring, and are very proud to note that we actually even got him to put the first ventilation statements on around opening up taxi windows and all that sort of thing. So yeah, it's quite an exciting time from a professional point of view. Disastrous from every other lifestyle perspective too. And then you can also, what's very good with this carbon dioxide, you can actually monitor. This is actually the SIOSH conference that they just held at Gallagher Estate, and you can see the concentrations were maintained to be very low inside the main auditorium. And then you'd actually then be able to cross-correlate what the concentrations are and how the risk is mitigated from far field transmission, not close field, but far field. Then obviously your exposure prevention. I mean, there's biosafety cabinets, there's personal protective equipment, there's regular sanitation and cleaning regimens. This is how bacteria, they get denatured by things like chlorine, like your sodium hypochlorite, your bleach, or your Jix. Alcohols are very good. We all understand the sanitization stations when we come into a place, and you know it's one of the reliefs that I feel is that one of the great things is, I think maybe COVID might be more transmissible from an airborne point of view, and it's way more transmissible by air than it is by common direct touch. However, we are sitting in a situation because of these protocols that everybody's hands are much cleaner, and that makes me as an occupational hygienist a lot sort of less paranoid when I go to a shopping center or whatever, despite the fact that there might be other controls that you want to look out for. Ventilation systems, very, very important to understand the limitations, and this is where the competence comes in as well. So you understand the limitations of a ventilation system. If it doesn't have good fresh air intakes, good filter systems and all that sort of thing. If you've got a split unit air conditioner that's just wall mounted, that is not ventilation, folks. And it's very important for me to impress upon that. That is definitely not ventilation. What you need is a fresh air to be introduced through an HVAC system. And then you can get your very low hanging fruits. I mean, if you go into a kitchen or a canteen and people are busy preparing food, what are you looking at? You're looking at cooked meat, raw meat. And so you want to separate these. And what you get is actually cutting boards that are this color. And that's what we want to see inside a kitchen. And then what you'd want, you never want your cooked meat and your poultry to be kept anywhere near each other, whether it's on the fridge or whether it's in the preparation area. Vegetables and that get prepared in a completely different environment to fish and other things. So there's very, very practical approaches to actually how to control this stuff. Obviously, when it comes to all these things, there's always a basket of barriers. It's not just one solution that fits all. You really want to actually interrupt that reservoir transmission pathway and then receive it in as many places as possible. And obviously, the higher the grouping or the classification of the biological agent, the more tiers that you actually want to have to be able to prevent the exposure. This is the basket of barriers for COVID, and so. That's kind of like a very important way of actually going about looking on how to interrupt the transmission. That is me. Thank you very much. I highly appreciate the time. Colleagues, I hope you find it, if not entertaining, interesting. And yeah, I hope you're coming away with this with more knowledge. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sean. That was very informative and interesting as always. I would just like to point out to people attending that maybe you can check out the Q&A section. We have been typing answers to some of those questions already. So maybe there's a question that you have been dealing with yourself and it has already been provided with some sort of answer. So please go and check out that section as well. In that vein, Sean, I've got two questions that I'd like for you to answer live. The first one from Busisiwe, I think, is just some clarification on your presentation, and it reads, this risk analysis procedure, is it referring to the normal risk assessment or the risk assessment conducted by an AIA? I think that just refers to one of your slides. If you could just try and provide.
Okay, so the regulation doesn't specify that you must use an approved inspection authority at all. You just need to actually obviously have a competent person, and if the person is competent, they will use a risk matrix to classify it. And that would be a common, if a Department of Labour inspector, and you can certainly support and correct me, folks, inspectorate, but if a Department of Labour walks in and they see a risk assessment that's got a matrix, they're going to feel way more comfortable that that risk assessment's been done by a competent person than if it doesn't actually have a matrix. Look, you can do a risk assessment without a matrix, and obviously you would then be able to control it in whichever way that you need. So the self-employed person doesn't have to use a competent person, but it's an employer that's not a self-employed person, which is everybody else, actually needs to use that competency. I hope that answers it.
I hope so too. Maybe Busisiwe can indicate to us if that is not adequate. We'll try and deal with it again. Then just the next question, if you can take care of that for us from Zachariah. In terms of the risk matrix, should the likelihood be based on the likelihood of exposure coming into contact with an HBA, or based on the likelihood that you will suffer a consequence if you are exposed? Or is it up to the employer to decide which method they will follow? Thank you, Sean.
Very, very good question, actually. So the consequence is going to be more around the grouping of the classification. So that'll be on the axis that actually talks about the severity. Then the likelihood is actually basically the probability of that exposure. So it's not really based on the consequence at all. The consequence is actually in its own matrix, and the likelihood is actually that dose component of it. So you can get something that's very sort of kind of harmless, but you could have a very high likelihood of exposure. Then your risk ranking would actually kick out that it's actually a lower risk than something that's obviously highly virulent and highly pathogenic, highly transmissible. And then that would obviously then kick out on a much higher risk when you look at the potential for that exposure to be quite high.
Great, thank you so much for that. Colleagues, so we are up to our comfort break right now. We are running a couple of minutes late, but not to fear. So we're still going to give you a 15-minute break. And I think, Gareth, if you can just confirm, I think if we can go from 12:25 to 12:40, that will give us our 15 minutes. And then we will
perfect, Liz.
all return then and continue with the last two presentations for the day. Thank you.
Thanks, Elise.
Thank you and welcome back, everybody. We're going to move on with the program, and I would like then to introduce Dr. Zungu from the National Institute for Occupational Health. We partner very closely with them when developing these regulations. And Dr. Zungu is going to present for us on medical surveillance. And I saw that several of the questions asked was relating to when would you be expected to conduct medical surveillance and what exactly would that surveillance then entail? And I'm confident that we will get all our answers in this presentation. Thank you, Professor Zungu, over to you.
Thank you, Program Coordinator. I hope that you can hear me well and clear.
Yes, sir, we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I am Muzimkulu Zungu from the National Institute for Occupational Health, and as well as coming from the University of Pretoria as lecturer in occupational medicine. Today, I will be talking to you, and thank you to SAIO and the Department of Employment and Labor for inviting us to contribute to this very important discussion. So today I'm going to be talking about medical surveillance. Primarily, I'm going to be talking about medical surveillance with respect to giving background on what is surveillance in occupational health, with particular emphasis on what is risk-based medical surveillance. I will also discuss the implications of the amended hazardous biological agents regulations of 2022 on risk-based medical surveillance. So in occupational health, as we are, all of us who are gathered here, occupational health and safety practitioners, when we talk about surveillance, we generally talk about the systematic monitoring of exposures. And I think that the colleagues before me, especially Sean, has related information regards to that. And we also look at then the results of the exposures, which is the health events in working populations, in order to prevent and control occupational hazards and associated diseases and injuries. And we do this by doing 4 main activities in particular. One, we gather information, and this information we gather primarily through what Sean was referring to in terms of risk assessment by collecting information on the hazards, but also on the medical side, we also look at what are the outcomes associated with those hazards that we have gathered information on. So that might also include desktop reviews and also experience from experienced health practitioners. And then the most important thing is then to take that data and analyze it so that you can be able to then create information that is meaningful, that can be given to the stakeholders in the workplace. And we're all aware of the importance of sharing information with all the stakeholders in the workplace. So once, for example, you've gathered data through the risk assessment, and you've analyzed it and you have information, you should take that information, give it to the employer so that the employer can make the right decisions to protect the workers in the workplace. But you need to give that information to the workers as well, whether it's through their representatives, so that they can know what to expect in the workplace and they can be able to act in accordance with legal instruction in order to protect themselves and the people that they work with. And of course, the regulator will need this information as and when it is required. Without action, there is no point in doing any of the surveillance that can be done in the workplace. So the most important thing is that after you've done your risk assessment, after you have used that risk assessment to plan your medical surveillance, then you must act. And this is very important, and it relates to the previous point on dissemination of information, that this information must be given to people who are going to use it to put interventions in the workplace to protect workers from the exposures or hazards that they would find themselves exposed to when they are within their workplaces. Now, when we further discuss this issue of surveillance in occupational health, we can broadly break it down into three things. Number one is hazard surveillance, and hazard surveillance primarily is related to what was presented previously, which is the monitoring of exposures in the work environment. And there's different ways of doing it, and there's different people with different capabilities who can do it. So it depends on the hazard surveillance, what you want to do. So not everybody. I know that we've spoken quite a great deal about the competent person, but it's important to also consider the qualifications and who that person. Like myself, I'm a medical doctor. I may not be able to do certain risk assessments that are specialized, that would require a hygienist with further training in that space. There is also medical surveillance. And the important part is that medical surveillance is always risk-based. Anything that is not risk-based and called medical surveillance, we must know it is not. For example, if I, as a medical doctor, I have a medical practice or a surgery next to your business, and you decide that you're going to bring your employees so that I examine them and I give them certificates of fitness. If I have never been to your workplace, I have not participated in the risk assessment, or I have not read the risk assessment that was done and used that risk assessment to decide on what medical tests and procedures I will do on the employees, then that should not be considered a medical surveillance as per the definition that is in the laws in South Africa. It can be any other medical examination, but it's not a medical surveillance. So a medical surveillance is the application of medical tests and procedures on workers who are at risk of disease or injuries based on the risk that those workers are exposed to. And usually this is done at the level of the workplace, because that is where workers are exposed to those hazards. But there is also public health surveillance, which is generally activities undertaken at a higher level in order to populate data at a national or provincial level in order to make decisions about a particular disease. We know during the COVID pandemic, when it started and as it's still ongoing, the laws in the country had provided for the submission of data by companies to the NIOH at some point whenever they get a case of COVID-19. So that would be public health surveillance, because that information is then used to protect the greater public from COVID, and using that information to make sure that we make the necessary decision for the workplaces in particular. So there are some laws that are important when you're going to do medical surveillance or any surveillance in the workplace. For the purposes of today's discussions, we're going to limit ourselves to the Occupational Health and Safety Act, as well as its associated regulations, and today in particular, the Hazardous Biological Agents regulations. There's also other laws like the Compensation for Occupational Injuries and Disease Act that requires surveillance of different sorts. So when we talk about medical surveillance, what do we mean? And I want to use a definition that is used in the law in South Africa, which is the Occupational Health and Safety Act number 85 of 1993. It is a planned program. And this is very important. Sometimes we just read the definitions without applying ourselves to what is the meaning of these words. When they say a planned program, what exactly does that mean? It actually means what I've said already, that one, there must be a workplace, and in that workplace, somebody should know what are the work procedures, and based on the work procedures, somebody must know what are the possible hazards or exposures that workers might be exposed to. And you must have looked at what controls have been put in place so that then you can plan your program as to what it is that you're going to be measuring or testing on people. When are you going to be testing it? And how are you going to be testing it? So you have to plan it. It has to occur after, at a minimum, you have gone and created your plans associated with the health risk assessment. So it also is a program that happens periodic, and it entails examination of the individual worker. And this examination of the individual worker may, and does not always have to include all these things, but may include clinical examinations, biological monitoring, or other medical tests. And it's important to know the difference between biological monitoring and all these other medical tests, which we'll not get to today. But more than anything is that this should be done by an occupational health practitioner, and in prescribed cases by an occupational medical practitioner. Now, this is very important. I have worked in certain environments where you find that there is a nurse who is trained in occupational health, but sometimes you find that the nurse feels that there should be a doctor who is trained in occupational health to do certain things related to medical surveillance. It is important to note that there are things that nurses can do, and they should feel empowered and confident to go ahead and do those things. Because as you know that our health system is nurse-driven in South Africa, we cannot always rely on the medical doctors because they are hard to find and usually are expensive, especially for small and medium enterprises. But in instances where the law specifically prescribes that a medical practitioner should do certain things, then the medical practitioner should be approached and the medical practitioner should do the medical surveillance for that particular workplace. Now, the purpose of medical surveillance is described and is clear. It is to systematically establish workers' health status where there is exposure to hazards. So you want to know the health status of workers where there is exposure to hazards, and you would know that because you would have done a health risk assessment. But it's also to monitor the effectiveness of your control measures that you've put in place to prevent those hazards from causing health outcomes on the workers. So this is essentially what in the previous slide was referred to as biological monitoring. So where you may test the worker for something within the worker to see if the worker has been exposed to a hazard and if the controls that you had put in place had prevented high exposures to the worker. It is also to ensure that if the worker is exposed, then there is appropriate medical treatment provided to the worker at the earliest possible time. So medical surveillance helps with that. And it's also, of course, to establish the need for removal from or the return of the worker to a particular working environment. So it's important to understand that medical surveillance, where it is done with clear intentions and clear understanding that certain actions should take place after that. I put up this slide to just show that medical surveillance is actually a fact-finding mission. It's not just something where you just go to a doctor and then the doctor tells you that, oh, you do or you do not have a disease, but it's a situation where whoever is the occupational health practitioner is going to ask questions in reference to the risk assessment and make sure that those questions that they ask are answered adequately so that they can be able to make decisions about whether there is a hazard that is in the workplace that might be putting that worker at risk. And if indeed there is a hazard, if that hazard has caused any early disease or damage or injury to the worker, so that if it has, then information can be given back to other stakeholders or colleagues who work within the occupational health team, because this is a team effort, so that then measures can be put in place to prevent further disease on the workers that are exposed in that particular environment. And if it's not going to be possible to remove that particular hazard, then it's to also talk to either the engineers or other people to look at, is there other ways of doing the job without using the particular mechanism that releases that particular hazard. So it is very important to know that when you're doing a medical surveillance, you are looking for something. So when doing medical surveillance, there's a number of medical examinations, and they're given different names, and usually they have different intentions, each one of them. So it's very popular that you can have a baseline medical examination. And this baseline medical examination is also described in the law that it has to happen within 2 weeks of a worker starting a job, so that the worker is properly assessed, and we make sure that the worker did not arrive with a particular disease or is not being made sick at a later stage. But it is also important to know that this baseline medical examination can also be called pre-employment or pre-placement. And these two are slightly different. I'm not going to get into the basics of it. Pre-employment is before you sign the contract. Pre-placement is when you sign your contract to decide if where you're going to be placed, are you fit to be in that environment or not. And then there's periodic examinations. These periodic examinations, they are very much linked to the hazards that are in the workplace. For example, people who work in hospitals and who are exposed to TB, we know that it is preferred that they have a yearly medical examination, particularly of the respiratory system, possibly that comes with a chest X-ray to monitor the possibility of infection by tuberculosis when they're in the workplace. There could be a possibility of other exposures or other infections that you may not necessarily need to do them annually. You may either probably need to do them every 24 months, or sometimes even earlier. You may have to do them every 6 months, depending on the organism, as it was described by Sean in the previous presentation. There's also a periodic examination that are done when, exit examination that may be done when employer is leaving the workplace, and other special examination. So there's different kinds of examination that can be done at any given time. So medical surveillance is appropriate only if it meets the following criteria in South Africa in terms of the laws. One, the work is associated with a recognized hazard. So there's an exposure that is recognized. And as I said earlier, you need to have a risk assessment. If you do not have a risk assessment, you would not know if there's a recognized hazard in that particular workplace. So if you just put your workers onto a bus and you ship them, you drive them to a particular doctor to just examine them, who has never looked at the risk assessment, who's not aware if there's a hazard, then that's the first sign that you are doing something not correct. There must be a disease or injury that is likely to occur in the workplace for you to can be allowed to do a medical surveillance on workers. There must be a valid method for testing for the particular health problem that will result from the exposure. So if you do not have a valid method, so a valid method means a number of things. One, the method must be acceptable to the worker and of course to the professionals. For example, if it means that you want to test me and you have to conduct a test that is going to be difficult and painful and likely result in problems for me as an individual, it might not be as valid. But also the test itself, it should be able to test what it intends to test for, because some tests may not be as sensitive and may not be able to test for what they intend to test for. But more importantly, when you do medical surveillance, it should be of overall benefit to the worker. So medical surveillance, as a general rule, is a medical opinion regarding the capability or the capacity of an employee to perform the task at hand. And that results in the provision of a medical certificate of fitness. But over and above that, it is there to assess the presence or absence of an occupational disease, or if there is a disease that is made worse by the exposure in the workplace. And ultimately, the point of doing medical surveillance for the employer is to improve productivity in the workplace. So when you're going to design your medical surveillance program, it is important to go through some important steps that are listed here. That includes having a policy. You must have an occupational health and safety policy that will talk to this medical surveillance. And this policy must have been consulted with all the stakeholders, including the health and safety committee in the workplace where people are represented. There must be an appropriately qualified personnel that is going to conduct the medical surveillance program. There must be access to equipment, appropriate equipment and infrastructure to do the medical surveillance. And there should be the risk assessment. What is very important about the risk assessment is that after you have done your risk assessment, there should be a time allocated between the health staff, the doctor, the nurse, as well as the hygiene staff or your safety staff, where they will sit together and design what is called the occupational risk exposure profile. What is this occupational risk exposure profile? It is a simple chart, usually a one-pager, that is going to tell you in advance that for a particular job, not for a particular individual, but for a particular job, before people are employed, in the job that they're going to be in, there are these exposures. And because there are these exposures, there are these controls that have been put in place. Because there are those controls that have been put in place, the residual risk means that they may develop these problems which are going to affect which organs in the body. And then you decide on the tests that you're going to do for biological monitoring, as well as for testing if there is disease. And this must also be approved by the stakeholders in the workplace well in advance. It will also help with preventing questions about discrimination. When you do not say in advance, some people may feel that they are targeted, and hence then there was an OREP that targets them. So you need to put out the criteria upfront. But you must also be able to say, when you find people who test positive, what is going to be your action? And of course, you must have your medical surveillance protocol and tools that you're going to share with everyone in advance. And everything must be done in an ethical manner according to your professional ethics. And there must be record management. And we've spoken about this in the first presentation today. I think Ms. Jabu spoke a lot about record management, and it is advisable to have health information management systems that are going to help you with this. And there's a number of them available in occupational health. So I'm going to move now to the implications of the hazardous biological agent regulations as amended on medical surveillance, in particular in the workplace. So based on the regulations, we find that there are a number of regulations within the hazardous biological agents regulations that refer to medical surveillance or have implications for medical surveillance. Number one, if you look at regulation number 4, it talks about an employer who undertakes work which exposes employee to hazardous biological agents has to inform the relevant health and safety representative or health and safety committee of the intention to conduct the following. And included there is medical surveillance and the importance of it. So that's one place where it is important. Regulation 5F, it says an employee exposed to a hazardous biological agent must subject themselves to medical surveillance. So you'd find that in some workplaces, and I'm going to be unfair on this statement because especially in the public sector, you'd find that medical surveillance sometimes is not done because employees do not present themselves, even when they've been invited to come to a medical surveillance, and there is no recourse put in place by the employer. So in the law, it says that the employee must present themselves. So the employers in the public sector can do something about it if they were to put more effort in making sure that medical surveillance is conducted. Regulation 6 also speaks to it, in that it says you must conduct and document a health risk assessment, and you must have a plan of action on that risk assessment. For medical surveillance in particular, it does not say you must have the OREP, but that would be one of the plans that you have. And it also says that an employer must review the health risk assessment if medical surveillance reveals adverse health effects where hazardous biological agent has been identified as a contributing factor, then you must go back to your risk assessment and do something about it. Hazardous biological agent regulation 7 is also another one, as well as hazardous biological regulation 8, also talking specifically around risk assessment, and it's important in medical surveillance. So in terms of medical surveillance, as per the regulations as listed in the previous slide, especially regulation 8, 2 to 4, it says that in-depth counseling and education is important before you conduct medical surveillance. And I found that it always helps to start the information on medical surveillance, usually when you advertise a post, just to say that people will be subject to medical surveillance depending on the risk assessment, so that they know and prepare themselves for these things, because you do need to get consent from employees to conduct any form of examination, including medical surveillance. But also when employees, they come into the workplace, it's an opportunity during induction that you speak to them about the medical surveillance program. So there are opportunities to do this in advance. And then of course, you can do it over intervals in the workplace as you will set for yourself. And you must have a written medical protocol that has been pre-approved before you use it. So employees have a right to can ask if you put them through a medical examination, if there is a protocol that has been approved upfront. And of course, the employer, as the main responsible person, must approve all your protocols that you're going to be employing in conducting your medical surveillance. So medical surveillance records, I'm not going to speak much about that, but all to say that you must keep your records. You must be able to find records after a certain period. And during inspections, inspectors may want to see those records, but also people in the workplace during the inspections may need to have access to records, pending, of course, formal written consent if you're going to share information about medical records of workers with other people. Medical examinations and tests, it is important that you keep such records, and they are that are stipulated in the law. And the law also stipulates about what you do with the records should the employer close down their activities. So such records should be kept at the provincial chief director in each province. So just to review what we've spoken about in this short session, we've tried to speak about what is medical surveillance, but we spoke about it from a point of view of surveillance. We described the 3 types of surveillance, and then we spoke about medical surveillance in particular, and we said for you to conduct medical surveillance in the workplace, you need to have a policy. There must be a risk assessment. That risk assessment must result in an OREP, and then you must conduct your risk-based medical surveillance in line with your risk assessment. It is important also to understand that the hazardous biological agents regulations have got implications for surveillance, as discussed in the previous slides with reference to specific regulations in particular. And with that, thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for everyone to listening.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that detailed presentation. It's much appreciated. Before I hand over to the next presentation, there's 3 questions, 2 of them, which I think is quite quick. Maybe we can just take care of them before we move on. The first one from Lebo is baseline examination the same as entry examinations? Doctor, if you could assist us with that.
Thank you. I think I did refer to it that baseline examination can mean two things. It can mean pre-employment examination. So that would be an employer who has a particular job would go out into the job market looking for potential people to come work for them. And they would start with a selection of a few. Once they have a selection of a few, they can then expose them to medical examination before they decide who they're going to take. That will be pre-employment. But there is also pre-placement. Pre-placement is then after you've selected the one person that's going to get the job, before they start the particular job, before they go to that station, workstation that they're going into, you then decide that, okay, I need to examine this person to check their fitness to work in this particular area. So that will be the pre-placement examination. So those will be the two in the main. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor. I think what I get from this is that employers must consider all these things before they actually advertise a job and can employ somebody. There's a lot of homework that sometimes gets overlooked. Then moving on to a question from Bosisewe. Can an OHB sign off a certificate of fitness or must it be an OMP? Thank you.
Yes. Now I'm hoping that the guys from the regulator will assist here. Based on my understanding of the law, an OHP is a competent person when it comes to doing medical surveillance. But the competency has got terms and conditions, of course, depending on what hazard you are working with and what regulations are available for that particular hazard. If that particular hazard you are working with has got regulations that are specific, for example, if you look at the chemical regulations, they are specific for an OMP, then you have to get an OMP. But where the law is silent, it just talks about an OHP, then if the hazards that are referred to by law that they require an OMP are not there in your workplace, I see no problem with an OHP signing off. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Professor. I think I can just add there that the OHB, occupational health practitioner, includes both what we commonly refer to as a doctor and a nurse. I think it's important to keep that in mind. Then just the final one before we move on from Simon is a rehabilitation functional assessment part of medical surveillance, and under what circumstances can we institute those tests? Can that duty be discharged by an OHB, or who is competent to do it? Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. I must say this is a question I've always been trying to avoid, primarily because over years, I've been in the industry now for 15 years. And when I was younger, when I read what occupational health says, it says you must modify the workplace to fit the worker, not the other way around. And when I first came across this, I wasn't sure what exactly is happening. But now that I'd like to think I'm older, my answer is I do not know. I can't say it is appropriate or it's not appropriate. I also think that there's other things in a country that you need to look at, not just the workplace itself, but you also have to look at other social economic factors. Because if you're now going to just dismiss people and say, well, you are not fit to go underground, for example, if they're in a mine, before you give them an opportunity to acclimatize, you might also be unethical in that you have a possibility to can put them in a position to can be fit to go underground. But my real answer is, I do not know what's the right thing under those circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, I think, thank you for your honesty there. Okay, so with that, we're going to move on to our final presentation for the day. And I'm going to ask then Toby van Reenen from the CSRI, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, to please share his presentation with us and take us through the maintenance and verification of control measures. We're all looking very much forward to that presentation. Over to you then, Toby. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'll just keep my video on just for the first slide, and then I'll switch it off to save everyone's bandwidth. During this discussion, we're going to talk about Regulation 12, which is maintenance and verification. In this chat, I only intend to highlight the significant changes to the regulation, and we'll also discuss then some acceptable responses to comply with the new regulation. I could summarize Regulation 12 as follows in these 3 points. So for all control measures, including your PPE, plant, machinery, and your facilities, risk-based maintenance and verification protocols must be developed, maintained, documented, and made available by a competent person. All control measures must also be maintained and verified in accordance with these protocols, and your results must be documented and made available. The updated Regulation 12 now places a greater emphasis on risk-based procedures and protocols for maintenance and verification. Also, since the design of verification and monitoring activities must now be based on risk assessments, the resultant performance monitoring of this equipment and the facility can then be accepted as a means of verification of your risk controls. So I want to thank Sean Chester for covering the risk assessment process so well, as this element becomes the cornerstone of the activities I need to talk about. Also, there's now a requirement for the documentation of the results to be made available for inspection. The previous Regulation 12 did not place an emphasis on risk-based protocols and record keeping, but this regulation now aligns with emerging international trends in biosafety guidance. And this slide is adapted from one of these emerging guides. Some of you may be aware of the risk management life cycle as recommended by the WHO in its set of guides and monographs on laboratory biosafety. So it's the risk management life cycle, and it starts with an element or activity of gathering information. You then use that information to evaluate your risk. You develop your mitigation strategy. From that, you will implement this mitigation strategy and then schedule your review, and the cycle continues. The same cycle is recommended for maintenance and verification life cycle to enable a continuous improvement in reducing residual risks. In the maintenance and verification life cycle, those activities could be relabeled as monitoring, analyze, improving protocols, operate, maintain, plan, and so the cycle continues. The regulations dictate that risk-based maintenance and verification protocols should include performance parameters and minimum acceptance criteria, performance monitoring methodology and intervals, routine maintenance requirements, specifications, and intervals. Just note that monitoring and maintenance are described separately. Some might think of this as a shared activity, but in accordance with the monitoring should inform maintenance activities and schedules. Then you have compliance with relevant standards, regulations, and manufacturers' requirements, and minimum competency and training required to perform monitoring and maintenance intervals. So those are the elements that should be included in your documented risk-based protocols. Now, to determine your performance parameters, as was required in your protocols, to determine your performance parameters, Your first requirement, as listed previously, a useful tool is the HACCP quality model. Specifically, the first 3 points of the HACCP control cycle, being 1, 2, and 3, identify hazards, develop critical control points, and establish limits. Your critical control points are those points in your process where risk assessment has identified failures with the highest likelihood and severity, and tools or methodologies like implementing and calculating risk priority numbers, which I think Sean alluded to. Risk priority numbers could be determined to inform the priorities of these risks or risk control measure. They say you should stick to what you know, and since I'm a ventilation engineer, I will give example of risk controls as engineering controls. Be careful not to confuse your risks and hazards at this stage. So examples of risks, and as an engineering control and ventilation system, one of the major risks you have from biological hazard perspective is agent aerosolization and transmission. Then some of your control measures are things like static pressure, air difference, local exhaust ventilation, primary containment equipment, and then your typical performance limits for those controls would be negative pressure or pressure cascading, a specific volume airflow rate to give you the right performance of your local exhaust ventilation systems, or for primary containment equipment like biosafety cabinets, your downward and inward flow, and there are standards for those which we'll address momentarily in a minute. What I want to impress upon you here is that monitoring and testing shouldn't be limited to operational tests. In any industrial or lab implementation project, monitoring and testing should encompass all validation activities, from design and development to long-term operational testing. This is a simplified model, and it's based on the validation V model used by engineers in pharmaceutical and other projects that require extensive monitoring, testing, validation. So you'll see we have, here's a project start. It's kind of a V. You've got your basis of design, which is followed by a design stage, which is followed by an installation stage, a commissioning stage, and operational stage. And you will see that there are reviews at these various junctions as you move from one stage to another. But the point I want to make is note that the operational testing parameters need to be informed by the functional requirements of your basis of design. So we're not testing for the sake of testing in operation. We're testing to make sure that what the performance measures of our systems are meeting our functional requirements for that system, as determined during the initial risk assessments, assuming it was all conducted. All of this is based on a risk assessment process, which it should be. Then during your operational testing, certain problems may be detected. The 8 disciplines, or 8D, that's sometimes referred to, methodology, or 8 disciplines of problem solving could be implemented to ensure a thorough, controlled, and well-documented corrective action process. Corrective actions that require engineering changes should follow good engineering practice and include review by engineering staff as well as QA staff. So these problem-solving disciplines, these 8 Ds, as they're referred to, are assigning a team, defining a problem, implementing an interim solution, we'll talk about that in a bit, performing root cause analysis, identifying corrective actions, implementing your corrective actions, then implementing preventative controls, and then a team closeout. Now, some of you might not be clear on what the difference between a corrective action and a preventative control. is the definition of corrective actions is corrective action is an action to eliminate the cause of a non-conformity and to prevent its reoccurrence, whereas a preventative action is an action to eliminate the cause of a potential non-conformity or other potential undesirable situation. Some might say preventative actions address the hazards while corrective actions address the risks. I don't always agree with that, although preventative actions should prevent the occurrence of similar problems, while corrective actions correct the reoccurrence of a specific problem. So when you're doing your problems solving from a specific non-conformance, you would put a corrective action in place to solve this problem, whereas you would put a preventative action control in place to solve any of this sort of class of problems. Then to achieve compliance with relevant standards, regulations, and manufacturers' requirements, you can refer to various performance standards and monitoring intervals, which are derived from a number of standards. I've just given a list of examples. Here's standards for compulsory specifications for biosafety cabinets, biosafety cabinet performance, biosafety cabinet maintenance. There's these standards for lab quality and competence, these standards for lab safety. The regulation 178, which is for the registration of biosafety laboratories. Strangely, surprisingly overlooked regulation. The National Building Regulations A19 and Regulation O, important standards for engineers anyway. And then for respirators and surgical masks, the Sounds 1866, parts 1 and 2, recently published, well, 4 years ago. It's not that recent anymore, I suppose. And then the Laboratory Biosafety Manual 4, which I've referred to already, and its monographs are called by the OIE and the WHO. And then also the Animal Diseases Act, which has the Act and associated checklists, which are used by the Chief Inspector. So all of these and many more need to be considered and incorporated into your performance monitoring protocol. And I've seen in the questions in the chat a lot of discussion around competence and the definition of competence. The problem is to broadly define, the problem is to narrowly define competence when there's a broad scope of skills required or called on by the regulation. The definition of a competent person in the regulation means a person who has, in respect of the work or task to be performed, the required knowledge, training, experience, and where applicable, qualifications specific to hazardous biological agents. However, when it comes to monitoring and verification, it's not just medical or environmental hygienists in this context. Because where engineering controls are applied, competence in the related engineering fields is also required. However, these intermittent elements can be contracted in. They don't have to be in-house in your organization. However, that competency is still mandated. And also, acceptable levels of competence in these activities may not be clear-cut and may be a moving target with emerging technologies like UVGI, and even within ultraviolet germicidal irradiation. There are emerging subcategories that do require specialist knowledge and competence. So fields like that and fields like the CO2 monitoring that Sean Chester referred to also require high levels of competence. It's in many senses, it's not just a matter of putting in a CO2 sensor. You need to know that the application of that data and those that equipment in your context is relevant and accurate. Also, with competence comes responsibility and accountability. I'd recommend an organization consider developing and maintaining a RECCE matrix. RECCE is responsible, identifies who is responsible, who is accountable, who is to be consulted, and who is to be informed of any maintenance verification tasks in its design, assessment, and implementation. RECCE roles should be defined by, RECCE roles should be defined by the role and not by a person or a specific company, because those might be fluid. So as an example, again, let's refer to what you know, speaking about ventilation testing specifically. Here, I've got an example of maintenance and verification tasks being filter testing, airflow testing, cleanup times, cleaning, validation, etc. And you will see different roles are assigned to, in this case, engineering maintenance, quality assurance, the lab manager, or the validation contractor. Also note that roles can be shared. Roles of accountability are generally not shared, but roles of responsibility can definitely be shared. Also, you might want to consider keeping and maintaining a training plan or skills matrix, training and responsibilities matrix. In this case, we've got the name of a person, the role of that person might have within your organization, and then activities or courses or skills that they need, and then a level of competence and against a required level of competence, and these kind of matrices can be scored per role, per organization, per subcategories for you to help identify where your strengths and weaknesses are, to ensure that that your staff are continually improving, and that you don't have any blind spots in the competencies within your organization. Training and responsibility matrices can also be drafted in separate tables if the training course details are complex. And then these need to be managed actively. These matrices are never a static thing. And then your records of monitoring and maintenance, your protocols and your records should be unambiguous. They should be simple to follow. They should prompt routine cycles. So the record itself must point to its position within a cycle of records. It should reference supporting documents if necessary, such as the protocol itself, if it's just a record of activity. And be creative, including graphics and sketches to explain processes, locations of tests, that sort of thing. Also remember, online tools exist for routine verification assessments. So yeah, you could speak to organizations out there that are in the business of supporting you in verification testing, and some of these have excellent online tools. So remember, use your risk management lifecycle for your monitoring. Monitoring isn't a dead-end activity. It should point back to itself in terms of a self-referencing continuous improvement cycle. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Toby. Very informative, as I say. It's really a specialized field that very few of us actually delve in so deeply. I'm happy to say that there are no questions relating to your presentation, so everything was crystal clear. Everybody's on board with your presentation, which is great. I would just like to maybe put Professor Zungu on the spot again. I see that he has typed an answer in the Q&A, but I think some participants might have lost or not been in attendance at that moment when he answered the question with regards to who can actually sign off a medical certificate of fitness. Is it the OHP or the OMP? He had a very spot on answer for us there. And if I can maybe just put him on the spot again to just repeat that answer for us, please, Professor.
Thank you, Program Director. Essentially, in terms of who can sign off, the clear answer is it depends. The occupational health nurse has a lot that they can do and can sign. But in instances where the regulations in particular are specific that you need an occupational medical practitioner, then an occupational medical practitioner has to sign off. How would you determine that? When you're doing a risk assessment, you'll identify different hazards, and those different hazards, some of them will fall within different regulations of the law. And because they fall within different regulations of the law, you have to read that law and see what it says, it stipulates. And based on what that law says about medical surveillance and who can sign off the medical surveillance, then you will decide who will do it in your workplace. But there's instances where you do not need the occupational medical practitioner, and you can only, you can use the available occupational health nurse. So there's a need, in my experience, for occupational health nurses, especially the younger ones, to be given, the confidence to not feel shy to take the responsibility, because I find that the younger ones usually are scared to sign because they worry about these things. They can sign on a certificate unless there's a specific regulation that requires a medical practitioner. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, Professor. And yeah, I think that concludes the questions. I don't see any other new questions posed that I need to deal with live. I would just like to point out that I think unfortunately there isn't for the presentations that you will be sent as attendees of this webinar, you will not be sent the Q&A because there is some personal information in the Q&A. Obviously, names are attached to the questions, so there are some restrictions as to what SIOS can share with you in that regard. But that is not a door closed. Please, if you do have any more questions, or if you feel you need to repeat a specific question, you want more detail, the department is always available to deal with these questions. Obviously, with regards to the regulations for hazardous biological agents, Jabu Mhlope is your starting point. You are more than welcome to contact her with any of your questions. If you do not know how to get a hold of her, I'm sure that SIOS will direct any of your questions towards the department if that situation does occur. I see there is some questions that popped up, but we will type some answers for you with regards to that. Just as we are closing, and with that, I would then like to hand over to Ms. Huna for her closing remarks. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ms. Lawrence. This was really a very informative webinar, and I hope that all the participants have benefited. And we have seen through the Q&A session, they've been interactively engaging. I want us to remember that the pandemic has taken us back to basics. All those lessons that we grew up with that we used to take for granted, they've been brought to the forefront. It is also important to note that we all have a responsibility to take care of ourselves and others. Hence, the Act and the regulations have stipulated duties for both parties, which is the employer and the employees. So both parties have to work together. Yes, the employer has got a duty to provide a safe and healthy work environment as far as reasonably practicable, but the employees have got a duty also to cooperate with the employer with all the requirements that are put in the workplace. So let us continue to make sure that we cooperate with each other so that we can continue to preserve lives beyond the workplace. I can see, want me to switch on my video, Gareth?
Thank you, Bulewa.
Yeah. I would like to thank our speakers who have dedicated their precious time in preparing all these informative presentations and also actively engaging with the participants on the Q&A session. We do not take your participation and collaboration with us for granted. We really appreciate the effort that you take in making sure that you deliver quality service, because it makes us proud to be working with you. I would also like to reiterate the thanks that Mr. Mapaha alluded to SIOSH, because this would not have been possible for you without hosting us. This day would not have been possible had it not been the hard work of the HBA Technical Committee members who worked hard during the hard lockdown, making sure that they are amending the regulations that were previously in place, making sure that they learn from the lessons that we're going through every day, everything that we're exposed to, all the lessons that were being learned, and they influence the regulations. So I would like to thank them all again, because we have this piece of the regulation through their hard work. So thank you everyone for participating in this webinar, and we'll meet again when we organize another one. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then from our side, Department of Employment and Labour, we thank you all for participating, and a special thanks to our presenters for your time and preparing such thorough and detailed presentations. It is much appreciated. Thank you, Gareth. Over to you.